to like extend the framework as well, like the AC framework?
Yeah, so in this drill, what you'll be doing is you'll be extending the AF framework, answering some of the 1 and C arguments against it, and then answering the neg framework. You should be careful to kind of make choices in the speech and not try to go for everything, but rather to kind of go for the arguments you think you're most likely to win and to weigh those, just because there's a lot of stuff here that would make it difficult to cover it all. And you should aim for the speech to be about, let's say, 2 minutes, maybe 2:30. You probably wouldn't want longer than that, though, in the 1AR when you have other stuff to do as well, like extending the AF. But we're just focusing on defending the util framework and beating the NC.
Okay.
Cool. What's the order going to be?
I mean, AC, NC. Do you want something more specific?
Where are you starting on the AC framework?
On the Ronheimer evidence.
Okay.
And then I'm just gonna answer, like, go on to the responses.
Cool. Sounds good.
Okay. Quicker reading the 1AR is just going to be a question of how government obligations are factored into the speech. Even if all your arguments are specifically true in context, how independent humans ought to be respected of their agency, and you're missing a key internal link as to how that specifically interacts with things like government obligations and how they ought to do things. So, for example, in the Ronheimer evidence says the government must be practical and concerned with the citizen interests and protection of citizen interests. That means that they can only rely on utilitarian principles that provide justification as to why we can protect ourselves. You can send the two impact justifications to 8 point. Government actions always lead to trade-offs, which means it's just a question of how we benefit some and harm others. Trade-offs are inevitable, which means it's a question of resolving them and creating the best options. B point, you can extend that as humans psychologically prefer util at all times. Governments are obligated to use it because it's just quite questionable for citizens independently. That's a geno evidence, and a geno evidence that's in the NC. First issue, you're missing the key internal, and that's why specifically arguments interacting with how governments can use this. You make one argument, that's why Germany is able to use things like a Kantian framework. We'll link to that argument later. Firstly, you see that respecting humanities and end themselves as most basic duty, but firstly, Oh yeah, 8 points argument is not warranted. That's why governments specifically need to reflect things like the humanities and itself. Also, B point turns it. That also never means how we specifically, even if we do respect humanities and ends, how that specifically guides action in a world where governments are forced to do things like trade-offs. Also, on the arguments, on the course for evidence, you see we have having a practical identity is a good thing and necessary. But 8 point is the reason why util doesn't care about practical identity is just a question how trade-offs are inevitably going to prefer benefit some and harm others. This is a question how we can categorically do things like affirmation. B point. This argument relies on things like universal law and having a practical identity as to why we should do certain things. Universal uniquely bad and fails uniquely bad because it never allows us to guide specifically never allows us to guide action. Also, you can cross by the UPAR evidence here. It indicates that we have no static first practical identity is fluid and always subject to change. Additionally, because in the starter and said that we don't have a read-around person, but our paths are developed instead. But this argument have any implication. Things how governments ought to be treated on the line by line of the Ronheimer stuff. Line by line stuff. All representing evidence. 2 states can be Kantian, but in Germany is obviously a consequentialist government. Yes, even German fiscal law says that the dignity is true. That would just be a reason why things like util is already able to acknowledge things like able to acknowledge things like human dignity is an important thing. But we have to rely on a constitutional system of morality, which relies on things like consequences. Also, you see that feasibilities and feasibilities are relevant. That's the only thing that matters when we can specifically tailor every individual person. When the government's only thing that matters. Additionally, you see the. Additionally, you see that the NC disproves that there's always a way to resolve trade-offs, but insofar as you always resolve trade-offs, that means that it's not applicable to governments because you're missing that internal link.
Okay. So some things that I liked about the speech, I think that in terms of word economy and efficiency, you did a pretty good job in terms of basically getting to a lot of what you had to. Your arguments were reasonably well developed and explained, so I thought that was good. And I think it was super easy to flow. I think a couple of the kind of top level things that I would work on. First is I think you need to signpost a little bit more clearly in that you sort of jump between flows a little bit in that you extend this Ronheimer argument, but there are kind of four responses to it that you sort of answer towards the tail end of the speech, but when you're on the NC, which is a little confusing because those arguments I float at least against the AF, because they were in direct response to this specific Ronheimer card. So as you extend Ronheimer, I would answer it then. So because I think that would be a little bit simpler, just to answer it kind of all in one place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The second thing is that I think you need to do a better job in terms of answering some of the arguments that were made in the overview against the AC framework, such as like this calculative regress argument that the framework collapses to rule util because rules produce good consequences, and that a good rule is freedom. The chorus guard argument that aggregation fails, just because those are all conceptual takeouts to the entire framework, that it makes it very difficult to win the framework debate without kind of answering each of those. So I would probably answer those at the very top of the framework, unless you want to do that after answering Ronheimer, but you need to answer those at kind of some point. The third, I guess, big picture thing I would say is that you want to be more conceptual in how you approach the framework debate. What I mean by that is you're doing a good job, I think, on the line by line, extending Ronheimer, but I think, A, you need to weigh this justification a little bit better, beyond just this trade-offs are inevitable and government obligations come first stuff, which was good, but I think you could do more weighing, and maybe even go for another justification and weigh it. And B is that I think you want to, similar to how the 1 and C makes these kind of 5 overview arguments at the top of the framework, calculative regress, collapses to the NC, personhood first, aggregation fails with chorus guard, and 5 utils unethical and repugnant, you should do something similar on the NC framework. Like give an overview and make some conceptual reasons why Deont fails or why your framework precludes. The reason then being is that it's kind of a way to, I guess, quote unquote, have offense on the framework debate, and that instead of just answering each individual justification, you have kind of large overarching reasons why their theory fails, which you can collapse to in the 2AR and really unpack. Now we'll talk a little bit about the line by line here. I think Ronheimer was pretty good. I would explain why it's practical and represents citizens' interests. You should have a component of it that talks about how states would lose kind of public justifiability if they were to follow certain inviolable side constraints. So, like, governments inevitably have to weigh trade-offs because they have to help the majority of people. So I would warrant that a little bit better. And like I mentioned before, you need to be more line by line on the stuff that was said on Ronheimer. But I'll talk about that when I get to the NC because that's kind of where you answered it. I think you sort of extend Gino through Inc., the argument that people psychologically prefer util, and that there are kind of a bunch of arguments here, like that freedom is key to act in the first place and to understand things psychologically, that end setting is psychologically liked, and that states are founded for the purpose of freedom. These arguments are not very good, but I think there are 3 arguments that are like reasonably well developed in the 1 and C that you need to answer. So I would either extend Gino and answer those, or I would just not extend Gino. So I guess that's the major thing on case. You should spend more time line by lining some of the answers that were made and answer this overview. I think one useful argument to go for is this no act mission distinction argument. The reason just being that strategically it's kind of a useful util trick to have, in that even if they win their framework, it's a reason why your offense links under their framework. Do you sort of understand what I mean by that? That if there's no act mission distinction, agency violations are equally bad if you commit one as opposed to just seeing one happen, which means that basically you can say freedom matters, agency matters, but we should aggregate instead, and them not acting in the face of injustice that the AF is talking about is a freedom violation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. The NC. I think you're repetitive in your very first argument that there's a missing internal link about how governments can apply the framework, because he sort of did that already with Ronheimer. And I wouldn't say the Germany example will answer that later, just because in the 1AR you don't really have time for this kind of projecting into the future, like, we'll do this type of thing later. You should just answer it when it comes up, just because you don't have time. Engstrom I thought was all right. I think your A point, but it's not about governments, is again a little repetitive. I would just explain why the idea that humanity should be treated as an end in itself is wrong, why universal principles fail. Chorus guard I thought was good. I wouldn't cross-apply the OPAR evidence unless you're going to explicitly extend it, just because the 1 and C had like 4 arguments on that about reductionism being false. So I would not extend those, not extend OPAR unless you're prepared to really defend it. Ripstein I thought was handled fine. And the last couple arguments about like feasibility and governmentality I think once again are repetitive. The speech I think took you 252 or something, so I would try to get that down to 230 or maybe less. this is a much more kind of a full court press on framework than you'll really deal with in any real debate. But if you can cover all this in like around 2-ish minutes, you'll be set because that's like a lot of stuff to handle, and you'll be able to do framework efficiently. So why don't you take some prep and let's try this one more time. Okay, so what's the order going to be?
AC, NC. So on the AC, I'm just gonna extend the Ronheimer stuff, and then after that, I'm going to answer them.
Okay.
And then I'm also going to answer the overview stuff there too.
Okay.
And then on the end.
Sounds good.
Okay. Extend Ronheimer finally, the government must be practical and only be concerned with citizen interests. Citizen interests, metaphysical questions are always going to stall government actions and never be able to guide how we specifically dictate certain things. You can say the first impact of government actions always see the trade-offs as a question of benefiting some and harm others. If the trade-offs are inevitable, you can also extend the second argument. Also another wing implication is that insofar as citizen interests are the only thing that matters, any other interest means you have to provide some sort of internal link from how citizen interests are able to guide how the government should operate as well. You can also extend the sensitive review emphasis and there's no actual distinction. Even if I don't commit a freedom violation, that's just as bad as being complicit in a freedom violation, which means that if the anti doesn't provide any motivation or any reason to guide action, that means it's just as bad as us being just as bad as us committing freedom violations. On the line by line on the Ronheimer stuff, firstly, you see the feasibility isn't irrelevant, but 8-point feasibility is the only thing that matters. If governments are feasibly carrying out actions, it means that we never resolve things material injustice. B-point. Next, you see some other particular circumstances, but 8-point, you abide by things like universal laws and reason, which means that you don't abide by things like particular reasons. Only util is able to look at specific circumstances and dictate what the best consequence would be. Next, you see the NC disproves this, that the only way to resolve trade-offs is system equal freedom. But 8-point, in some human that it's resolved trade-offs. That just means that individually every person has their justification for how they ought to act, which means that the government would never operate and never able to do things because that means that they would never be able to violate a system of individual freedom. You see states can be Kantian, but no, Germany is obviously not a Kantian government because you would never be able to do things like pass policy or rely on consequences, which will also mean that insofar as Germany isn't just a Kantian framework, it would definitely indicate that the util is able to abide by things like Kantian notions and standards. Only over yourself. You say calculative regress, but 8-point are starting about warranted, and B-point this turns because the only way we can ever guide action is through utilitarianism. Do you see the act util reflects the util, but 8-point bad util is bad because it never motivates us to do anything. It also means it applies to this doesn't apply to states because it's a form of universal law. Universal law is bad and it's unable to specifically look at specific instances and guide action from that point. That point. You see a state of affairs is an important value in an individual state of affairs is important, but no, util cares about people. Util cares about people because insofar as we treat every individual the same way, that also evident by things like that trade-off stuff. That's the only way we can treat every individual the same way. Also, the aggregation stuff. You say aggregation fails, but no, it's not a question of aggregation. It's just a question of state obligations. On the NC, firstly, 8-point. On the interim evidence, 8-point aggregation distinction means that you're just as complicit in things like freedom violations by not acting things like material injustice and violence occurring already means you're complicit in it and uniquely denies things like freedom. People turn the basic duty as a citizen, turn the only basic duty we have as a citizen interest as the government also the force by everything was the identity static enabled such a change. We have different static identities, which means that we can value a person. What I might be good at right now, let me do that or later. Also, B-point, I can value my own person, but then I'm going to value your person, which means the government has to resolve these issues with trade-offs. Also, on the agencies, on the last evidence, you say agency relies within the human nature, but 8-point, the only agency only matters if you use it right. If you don't use it right, it doesn't matter. I think things like resolving material violence also be fine. I do theories uniquely bad instead of the guide action. Also, some overview stuff. 8-point. 8.8 things like I think there's paper of material injustice and violence because only things like the examination and not actual true emancipation. B-point this doesn't apply to governments because you're missing that key internal link. Also, C-point practical reason identity doesn't help us guide action because it's not motivational. Like even if I do a practical reason to do something, it doesn't mean I'm actually going to do it because it doesn't guide motivation. That was really long, I know.
Yeah, so I thought that was definitely better. I think the length is kind of the first thing, in that was nearly the length of a full 1 AR. And I think, like, while there are a lot of arguments, you want to practice being able to kind of truncate the speech a little bit, so that way you would be able to execute a speech similar to this in like a real 1AR. So about like half the length I think would be ideal, just because you'll obviously never be able to just spend the entire speech on the framework debate, whether that's because you have to extend the AF offense, answer the NC, answer like a theory argument or a DA or whatnot. So I would try to give the speech again at some point in a little bit less time, so that way you have time to like do other things in the speech. I think argumentatively the speech is pretty good. I think on the AF, I think you do a better job impacting Ronheimer, so I thought that was good. And I thought you did a good job on the line by line. I think you're a tad inefficient on the line by line in Ronheimer, and for a couple of reasons. A is that you kind of spend a decent amount of time repeating the 1 and C's arguments. You're like, they say it goes neg because particular principles are key. That just takes a while to say. Just be like their second argument and just answer it. Or even just like particularism not key. I would spend less time kind of backtracking and repeating their arguments. I thought the overview stuff was also fine. I wouldn't bother extending this act omission distinction stuff if you're not going to really deal with the objections to it, like that it doesn't justify util because there's an intention foresight distinction, and that it's impossible to hold people accountable. If you're not going to invest in going for it, I probably just wouldn't bother. I think you can get through the case probably about 30 seconds quicker, just by giving it a few more time and being more efficient, which would help you. The NC. I think argumentatively, like I said, everything is fine. I would put this overview stuff sooner and cut out the B point about not applying to governments because you said that on the case already. And I think that like one thing that might help you would be just to like be explicitly more comparative between the arguments. Not only that like on Court is good, for example, that we form different identities, but rather I would say like something a comparative reason why your framework might co-opt that, i.e. like practical identity might matter, but people kind of with those identities value ends like the preservation of life and happiness, which proves like your framework kind of subsumes a large portion of theirs. Otherwise, I thought it was fine. Do you have any questions about the speech?
No, not really. So, no, yeah, I think I'm good.
Okay, cool. I thought it was definitely an improvement.
What do you think are some better answers to the Ripstein evidence about states being Kantian?
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention that. I think your answer to that's a little circular, where you're just like they're not Kantian because states could never pass policies if they were Kantian. I think that's kind of question begging at the point where this evidence is saying that states can pass policies in a Kantian way. I think the argument instead should be that they are not pure Kantian, and that they're even if they follow certain overarching principles, there are no absolute side constraints. So like Germany would never say, like for example, you definitely cannot kill no matter what. And to some extent has to aggregate because they do things like poll citizens, count votes in a democratic election, etc., which proves that aggregation to some extent is inevitable.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but I thought overall the speech was solid.